Hey everyone, this is Lyndon. Welcome back to a new tutorial for motionarray.com. So you can see here what we'll be creating. It looks pretty visually interesting. So this is a particularly large project for a tutorial, so we'll actually be separating this into 3 parts. So it'll be a 3-part tutorial. We'll get as far as we can in this tutorial in about 20 minutes. But it's definitely a very realistic or practical project you'll probably find yourself facing sometime throughout your journey in visual effects. And at first glance, a lot of effects like these seem pretty easy, but when you actually get in there and actually start trying to create the effect, it turns out to not be so easy. And it's really difficult to be creative. Everything's not very clear, it's not straightforward, and it turns out just to be a really difficult project to create. But the skills we're going to learn today are definitely in very high demand, and hopefully this will be sort of a breakthrough in your artistic ability and skill set, and where before you felt a lot of resistance and mind blankness, if that's a word. So with all that being said, I hope you guys are feeling motivated, energized to learn these skills, and if so, I'd like to start creating this scene. Alright, so we're here in a new After Effects composition. So the first thing to understand about this project is that we're going to be working in 3 dimensions. So what we're going to do starting out is create a camera. So we can hit on the keyboard Control Alternate Shift C, and that'll create a new camera. So now for type we have 1 node or 2 node. We're going to make sure and hit 1 node because if you don't know the difference, 2 node cameras automatically orient towards a certain point. We don't want that. We just want a straight 1 node camera that we can transform. So like I said, we're going to be working in 3 dimensions, and one helpful technique is to look at your 3-dimensional scene from different views. So here we're in the active camera. We can go from a top view and can also look at different views. So it's very helpful to spatially comprehend your scene by looking at it from these different angles. And we'll be doing this throughout the tutorial. So we're here at a top view, and what we're going to do next is create a new null object. So again, Control Alternate Shift Y will create a new null object. You can also create any new element by going to Layer, New, and just finding your object here on the list. But I think it's a good idea to use shortcuts. It speeds up your workflow. Might as well just learn the shortcuts. So we'll call this motion, and we want this also to be a 3-dimensional object, so we'll hit the 3D layer button here. And what I want to do is parent this camera to the motion null object. So basically this camera is now attached to this null object, so wherever I move this null object, the camera's going to follow. Alright, looking good so far. So the next step, what we're going to do is create a new light. So Control Alternate Shift L, it's always Control Alternate Shift and then some kind of letter for these more advanced elements like cameras, lights, null objects. So we'll call this red streak. So basically this light is going to define the path of the streak. And we're going to have 2 streaks, so we'll create 2 lights. So duplicate this and we'll call this blue streak. We'll move this over here. I also would like to parent these 2 lights to the motion. So now this this motion null object controls the entire movement of the scene. So now what we want to do is animate this null object in this direction, so these lights will leave behind a trail or a streak. So if we animate this null object this way, these it'll allow these lights to leave behind a streak of particles. So that's just a little foresight about how this effect is going to work. So to animate this motion null object, I'll click P for position, and I'll right click on this position parameter, hit separate dimensions. Instead of having all 3 of the position values in an array, we now have each dimension in a separate parameter. So this is helpful. So we want to animate the Z position. We'll do this with an expression just to make it easier. We'll hold alternate, click the stopwatch, and we'll type in time times 100. So it doesn't matter, we can easily change this value, but for now it just animates that null object forward, so we can have motion to the scene as though these streaks are traveling through space. So now that we got a good setup, we got a good system to work on this project, we're gonna go ahead and start with the animation. So I'll start animating the red streak. I'll go ahead and turn off the blue streak just so I won't get confused. So let's click this red streak, and what I'm gonna do is hit P for position. I'll right click and also separate the dimensions, because later we want to be able to adjust these values independently in the graph editor to make smooth and fluent animations. But what I'll do is go to the very beginning and just make a keyframe for all these 3 position parameters. So I'll click on the camera. I can see where the edge of its view. I just want to move this red streak right along the edge of that. Okay, so we're going to move forward in time, maybe a little past 1 second, pretty arbitrary, and we'll move this red streak into the camera's vision. So it automatically creates another keyframe, so we can see it kind of animates. We can also go back in our active camera to make sure this looks good. So I'll make a few adjustments. I'll move this Y position down like this. And actually I can select both of these keyframes and change the value of both of them at the same time. So I can move it down like that. So it kind of comes from under the camera into the scene. Okay, let's go ahead and continue the animation. So we're just going to create a rough draft of, the kind of basic motion of this light streak. So I'll move forward in time and move this light to the other side of the screen. So we have some good variation in the motion. And then we can just continue this rough draft of the motion. So we'll move forward in time and just, move it around, move it to spots that hasn't been. And also one thing to keep in mind is that we want the speed of this animation to be roughly the same throughout the whole animation. And you can see the speed at any point in time by the distance between these two dots. Or if it does change, for it to be gradual. We don't want it to be fast and then suddenly slow, then fast. Let's keep everything fluent. Just about being creative with the path of the animation, creating cool spatial movements, and I guess basically the goal is for us to create an elegant soaring movement. So that's kind of the theme of this animation. So it's good to always think about your theme, get a good idea of what you're really going for, and just a simple understanding of that will really help you be fluent and creative with your animation. And we'll make it go to the center here. So to make it go completely to the center, I'll turn on title/action safe, and I'll move this light to the center here. And I think I want it to collide at the center here at about 6.5 seconds. So I'll select all these keyframes, and one really useful technique we can do is hold alternate, grab the last keyframe, and it'll stretch or squeeze your animation. That's really helpful. And one thing to keep in note is that your keyframes won't actually be on a frame. They'll be just of how it's stretched, the math it didn't. It's not going to land perfectly on a frame. But we don't even have to move it on a frame, because you can see here if we just go next to that keyframe, if we just change the position, then it's going to automatically magnet to the exact point of the frame. So now that we've got our basic motion, we have the basic geometry of our motion, we need to start refining this and making it look more elegant, alright? So, but before we do refine it, make it perfect, we have to do something else. And that is, we got to think about our camera motion. See, because if we refine this, this motion and get it just like we want it, and then we start adding camera motion, then it's going to change the position of this light, and that's not going to be exactly how we want. So what we got to do is do our camera motion first, and then refine the perfect position of this light. So hopefully that makes sense. But order is really important, because if you don't get the order right, you're going to end up having to recreate your perfection, if you know what I'm saying. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add random rotation to this camera. So we'll click on the camera and hit R. So this opens up the orientation and rotation parameters. So what we'll do is add an expression to the X rotation first, and we'll type in wiggle, and then we'll do parentheses. For the frequency, we'll do about 1, and for the amplitude, let's do 10. So the X rotation kind of causes up and down movement, like a vertical pan, just like that. And we can also copy this expression, hit Control C, add an expression to the Y rotation, hit Control V. Now the Y rotation is going to add horizontal movement to the scene. So we can kind of see what's going on if we get a custom view. This the camera just kind of rotating around to add a kind of a natural active movement to the scene. And also while we're at it, we'll do some Z rotation. And we probably don't want quite as much Z rotation, because the Z rotation causes it to slant back and forth. So we'll do a little bit less. So for the amplitude, let's do about 5. I probably actually want a little bit more Y rotation, because that's the horizontal movement. So we'll do about 15 for the Y. So one thing you have to think about is that this wiggle kind of wiggles the value back and forth randomly, but the random still has seed. Like suppose you don't like the kind of random way this camera is moving. What you can do is just change the layer index, because the layer index, you hear this 4, that's the layer index. The layer index defines the seed of the wiggle. So if we change the index of the layer by moving it above another layer, the index now turns to 3, and now it's going to randomly wiggle in a different way. So what we're going to do is make sure we keep the same index, so that when we refine the scene to be perfectly how we want it, we don't get different random motion that mess up our scene. So now right when these lights come together and collide in the middle here, I don't want any camera rotation. So how are we going to do this? What we'll do is go to the effects and presets and type in slider, and we'll put this on just any object that can actually hold an effect. See, we can't put this on camera because the camera can't actually hold an effect. And what this slider controller is just a basic empty value. It doesn't do anything, it's just a value. Right around 6.5 seconds, I'll add a keyframe with a value of 0. And then I'll go back quite a bit and then change the value of this keyframe to 1. So this slider animates from a value of 1 to 0. We can even go to the graph editor, click this button here, click on the slider, and we'll make this an easy ease, just like that. So what the purpose of this, what we're going to do is actually multiply these rotation values by the slider, so that when the slider goes down to a value of 0, there can't be any movement, because any number multiplied by 0 is just 0. So we'll click here on this first rotation expression. On the keyboard, let's hit Shift 8, and that's going to do times. And we'll grab our pick whip and choose the slider parameter. So we multiply the wiggle value by the slider parameter. Okay, and we can copy this multiplication operation here, and then we'll paste it on the other expressions. So what's going to happen here? You can see that these values are now 0 because it's being multiplied by a value of 0, and here as we go towards 1, it's getting multiplied by a higher value. So now there's movement here. So hopefully this is making sense, and we can even refine the animation of this slider. So if you didn't know that, capture that one in your library of knowledge. Alright, looking good. So we got the camera motion exactly how we want it. So now we're ready to begin refining the motion of this red streak light. So let's hit P so we can open our position parameters, and we definitely want to be in the graph editor. That's the only way we're going to make smooth curves and fluent animations. So let's click our graph editor icon, and we'll start out by selecting X position and Y position. And the first thing you probably want to do is select all your keyframes and then convert all your keyframes to auto Bezier. There we go. You can see here we got a little bit of smooth movement going on here, but there's definitely more we can do to refine this. So there's several ways we can go about smoothing out this change in motion. And the first way is just to make a larger curve. And basically a larger curve is just like the velocity changing direction more slowly. Well, there's actually other ways we can go about smoothing this curve. For instance, instead of just directly curving the direction we want to go, we can actually curve around in the other direction and end up in the same motion, but we turned around in the other direction to get there. It's just different ways of continuing a smooth velocity. So let's look at how we can create something like this first. So basically what needs to happen is there needs to be vertical motion at this keyframe point. And hopefully that makes sense, because if there's upward velocity at this point, then there's going to be a curve because it'll be moving upward. So let me select the position X and Y again. So basically if I just click this Y-axis graph and extend it out a little bit, I can actually change its direction to cause a curve. And also, the longer the light stays in this position horizontally, the more time the vertical motion will have to create that curve. So if we extend the tangents of this horizontal motion, the vertical motion will have more time to create that nice curve, and it will be smoother. So a lot of times creating a smoother animation just has to do with extending the tangents so that the velocity can't change so quickly. There we go. That should be a pretty smooth curve. Look at that. That was really smooth. So that's how we create more of just a regular smooth curve. Now let's talk about how we continue the flow of motion by this fish loop. So basically it has to do with changing the angle of this tangent. If we just shift it in the other direction, we create more of a fish loop where the upward velocity continues and it loops around. That's just another way of continuing a fluent motion. Alright, so that's kind of how we create that fish loop. And it looks really fluent in its own way. So these are just different techniques you implement into your library of creativity so you'll have ideas and, like I said, techniques that you'll be able to apply when trying to be creative with these projects. So I'll go through here, try to smooth out some of these curves, and basically it just involves extending the tangents. Now, one really good technique for animation, making smooth curves, is limiting as many keyframes as you can and trying to control the shape with the tangents. So for instance, I could delete this keyframe here, and if I just extend this tangent, then we'll get a pretty similar shape, yet it's forced to be smooth since the change is caused by the tangent, and tangents are always going to be smooth. So we'll try to limit as many keyframes as possible. So I could probably get rid of this one, just extend the tangent here. We originally create the keyframes so that we can more clearly define the shape that we want these tangents to follow, but once we have that shape, we can go through piece by piece and recreate that shape with tangents. Hopefully that makes sense. So look at that. Look how smooth these curves are. We just know this is going to be a good animation. So here's an example where I would kind of want a fish loop rather than just a direct curve. So what I can go here is go to the vertical motion and just change the tangent here. It's going to create kind of more of a fish loop instead of a direct curve. So the next thing we need to think about is going through and refining this animation in the sense of the fluency in the speed. So we want, for instance, right here it might be moving too slow. We can see the distance between these dots is a lot smaller than the distance between some of the other dots. So here's how we go and refine the animation to make the speed more consistent and distributed. So for instance, if we want the light to be moving a little faster in this part right here, what we could do is select all the keyframes before that point and stretch them towards that point, so it's going to squeeze the time, which results in a greater speed. So that's how we do that. The shape of the animation should be preserved since we're only stretching it through time and not a value. Okay? So we just want to go through the animation and make these speed adjustments to our liking. So now that we have really fluent and distributed speed, we want to make sure the shape of this animation is right. Now, if we want to change the shape in any way, it's not a good idea to do it up here in the controls. Let's go down here to the graph and just change the values down here so that we don't mess up any of our smooth tangents or create new keyframes that'll mess it up. And also one thing I'd like to encourage you guys to play with is the speed graph. So you can go down here and you can see here where it says edit value graph. We're just going to change this to edit speed graph. And now instead of seeing the value of the position, we can see the speed of the movement. And if we kind of smooth out the speed graph, we're definitely sure to have a smooth animation. But you want to be kind of careful because this speed graph can kind of mess up the shape of your animation. So it's just about trying to finding ways to smooth it without messing up the path of the animation. So for instance, we have some kind of rugged, kinky areas over here, and we should definitely find ways to smooth this out. Alright, there you go. We can see how we kind of smoothed out this speed graph. So right now most of the movement is back and forth, up and down in 2 dimensions, but we need to add a little bit of Z movement. So this is pretty much up to your interpretation. Just make some random movement just so that it has variation. So we'll probably get rid of a lot of these keyframes, just keep a few in there. There, that should be pretty good. Now we just have to smooth this out. Alrighty, looks good. So now what we have to do is animate this blue streak. So that was a pretty long process, but we ended out with a pretty smooth, elegant animation. And hopefully you guys learned a lot of these techniques because we covered a lot of information. So if you guys really retained all that information, you should be pretty comfortable with being creative with unique and fluent animations. So that learning process may have been a little tough, but if you made it all the way through it, you should definitely benefit from the skills you'll have from here on out. So now what we're going to do is just animate this other light. So from the beginning, we're pretty much going to repeat this process, but we'll just animate this second light here and make it do its own unique thing, but we also want it to kind of harmonize or interact with this other light. I'm definitely not going to explain in detail how we're going to animate this second light. Pretty self-explanatory, same technique, same details. Let's just go ahead and do it through a time lapse. Okay, so here's our final animation. This turned out really nice. I hope you guys feel a little more powerful in your creative skills to be able to blast through any animation projects. Although the final result looks pretty awesome, we didn't get to create any real visual effects or graphics in this tutorial because of all the background pre-work we need to do. But now that we're past all the hard stuff, be sure to receive the fruits of your labor by watching the next tutorial where we create all the cool glowing visual effects and everything. So that's it for this video. I've had fun presenting all these techniques and going through the tutorial with you guys. Be sure to stop by the website motionarray.com and view all the other tutorials and visual effects templates. Even if you are a talented, experienced artist, templates are a really good way to save time and effort while still receiving the results of work that has had time and effort put into it. Not to mention the creative platform it allows you to build off of. Anyway, that's it. My name is Lyndon, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial from Motion Array. Thank you.